Hello and welcome to Samuel's Fortress. I'm your host Kirill, and today we're going to be discussing the origins of the Serbs and the Croats. Now, the reason why I'm making this video is because in the next two upcoming videos, we're going to be discussing the history of early medieval Croatia and then the history of early medieval Serbia, and those videos will be coming out shortly. However, before we get into the history of those two nations, the creation of their medieval states, the rulers, the wars and conflicts they were engaged in, all the various religious disputes and so forth, I thought it would be helpful to kind of at least go back and lay a bit of a foundation to these two peoples, the Serbs and the Croats, to kind of establish who they are, where they came from, and so forth before we get into kind of the more substantive medieval history of those two nations. So that's what we're going to be doing today. So to kind of jump into it, if you recall from way back when this channel first got started last year, we did a two-part series on the Slavic invasions into Macedonia. And we kind of went over how in the 6th century we started seeing kind of large-scale, massive invasions, migrations, however you want to call it, of Slavs into the Balkans. However, what we did not discuss in those videos was actually one of the major factors which led to the arrival of the Slavs on such a large scale, and that is the arrival of the Avars. Now, the Avars, not a whole lot is known about the Avars, but we do know that they were a kind of a Eurasian steppe peoples who arrived in the Balkans in the 6th century, and not just in the Balkans, but also into the Pannonian Plain, kind of the modern region of Hungary and so forth. So, like I said, not a whole lot is known about the Avars. They're kind of one of these mysterious Eurasian peoples, Eurasian groups who emerged from the steppe during this early medieval period. So we don't know a whole lot about who the Avars were. Now, I'm not an expert at all in the area of kind of genetics or ancestral DNA or anything along those lines. However, kind of the limited research I did online regarding kind of who the Avars were and kind of, some of the research that's been done into their, DNA and so forth reveals that roughly 85 to 90% of the Avar kind of genetics are similar to that of the Eastern Europeans and Balkaners, pretty much kind of Western Eurasian DNA, whereas kind of 10 to 15% of their DNA, kind of their ancestral DNA is quote-unquote East Eurasian, so I'm guessing kind of more of the Eastern Eurasian steppe, kind of towards, Mongolia and so forth. So they probably, despite this small percentage of kind of Eastern Eurasian DNA, they probably appeared more or less similar to the Slavs and the other Eastern European peoples. So that's kind of the Avars, basically a kind of Western Eurasian steppe peoples. But nevertheless, regardless of who the Avars were, they did have a significant presence among the various barbarian raiders who kind of came into Europe, kind of came into the Roman sphere of the world during the early Middle Ages. And here I'm going to be using John Fine's Early Medieval Balkans to kind of discuss these Avar arrivals into Europe. He writes, quote, "Large-scale Slavic settlement began in the Balkans in the early 570s and early 580s. These larger population movements, still on the level of individual tribes, are associated with the arrival of the Turkic Avars, a nomadic group who, having lost a major war with the other nomads in the east, had then migrated west, subjugating various Caucasian tribes and other groups north of the Sea of Azov and the Black Sea. They annihilated the Antes as a political force and then subjugated various Turkic Bulgar groups. They appeared north of the Danube at the end of the 550s and in the mid-560s, established themselves in what would later be known as the Hungarian Plain, with their main settlements between the Danube, after it bends north, and the Tisa rivers. In the Balkans, archaeologists have found vestiges of Avar settlements along the Sava and Danube rivers as far east as the mouth of the Morava. Further east, along the Romanian and Bulgarian sides of the Danube, Slavic sites are found, but not Avar. Thus, the Avars settled west of the main Slavic concentrations. The Avars were excellent soldiers and horsemen. They were tightly organized with their ruler, called a Kagan, supreme over the various Avar groups. They made treaties with their neighbors and fixed frontiers. Below them was a vast array of subject peoples, various Slavic and Bulgar tribes, plus the remnants of the Huns. In addition to subject tribes, they also had a large number of vassal tribes, with others as allies. The Avars asserted their authority over many Slavs and other peoples north of the Danube. Since the Slavs were divided into numerous petty tribes, they were easily subjugated. The presence of the Avars surely sent other Slavs scurrying south across the Danube to escape subjugation or tribute. Now, the reason why these Avars and their arrival into Europe is so important is because they essentially cleared the way for this mass movement of Slavs into the Balkans, which probably would not have occurred if the Avars had not kind of cleared the area of Roman control, essentially. Here I'll continue quoting John Fine. He writes, quote, "The presence of the Avars also curtailed the pattern of gradual settlement of Slavs in the Balkans. This had been the pattern up to then, and had it been allowed to continue at the same slow rate, the empire in time probably could have gradually Hellenized them. For despite some Slavic settlement, there was up to that time no sign that the Roman Balkans had lost their Roman character. However, the presence of the Avars, who either mobilized Slavs as troops or caused them to flee in large numbers, was an impetus for the large-scale Slavic settlement to the south of the Danube. The settlement of Slavs was also facilitated by Byzantine involvement during much of the period in a war with the Persians. Thus, they could not bring troops to the Balkans. Furthermore, the Slavs were aided in their conquest by their large numbers. They simply infiltrated and eventually submerged whole regions. Their lack of organization was also a help. They had no overall political leader to defeat in battle, and thereby force their retreat. It was necessary to defeat each individual little chief and tribe, and that was impossible. The Avars, however, were masters of sieges, and now cities began falling to them and their Slavic clients. The loss of cities often led to the loss of imperial control over whole regions. In 582, the Avars conquered the Byzantine border fortress of Sirmium, or modern Sremska Mitrovica, which eliminated a major Byzantine border defense post, and soon the Slavs were pouring into the Balkans. The fall of Sirmium has always been depicted as a major event. Possibly its importance is somewhat exaggerated, for before its fall it was possible to bypass Sirmium and cross the Danube elsewhere. In addition, various sources mention large-scale Slavic campaigns in the year before Sirmium's fall. In any case, it fell in the period of 581 to 584, during which most scholars date the first massive Slavic invasion settlement. So basically what we see here in the Western Balkans during this early medieval period, during the 6th century, is pretty much the same thing that we see happening in Macedonia and in Bulgaria, pretty much. I mean, it's kind of the phenomenon of these Slavs coming in first in very small numbers relative to the Roman population, and this kind of slow, gradual migration of Slavs doesn't really change the demographics of the Roman territories too much. I mean, due to the small numbers, as we just read from John Fine, the Romans were able to assimilate them and kind of Romanize these Slavs and the other quote-unquote barbarian tribes coming from north of the Danube. However, once the floodgate breaks, essentially, and the Slavs start arriving in very large numbers and massive waves, then the demographics shift significantly, and the Romans are essentially overrun by the large number of Slavs that arrive into those regions. In Macedonia, for example, which we discussed in previous videos, the Roman population within the Macedonian interior kind of fled towards the coast, towards Thessaloniki, which was a fortified Roman city where they could avoid the Slavs and so forth. That's pretty much what happens in Croatia as well. We see that as the Slavs push in from the Pannonian Plain towards Dalmatia, a lot of the Romans will flee the Croatian interior and will settle in these coastal cities, these fortified coastal cities such as Zadar, Split, Dubrovnik, and so forth, which remain under Roman control. So again, these both in kind of Macedonia, in kind of the Eastern Balkans as well, Bulgaria, but alongside that in the Western Balkans, we see that the interior becomes primarily Slavic. Now, in the West, the Avars will rule a large portion of that territory. The people there are predominantly Slavic. However, the Slavs are being ruled over by the Avars. Therefore, large portions of the Western Balkans are, again, ethnically Slavic, you could say, but ruled over by the Avars, again, with the Romans controlling the coastal fortified cities. Now, by the middle of the 7th century, the Avars will begin losing control of their territory as their power is challenged by other powers arriving from Eurasia, coming out of the steppe into Europe, and those groups will be the Serbs and the Croats. There were several revolts against the Avars in the period from the 620s to about 640. Samo's revolt in what is now Czechoslovakia in 623. The reference to fighting between Slavs and Avars in 629, and Kubrat's Bulgar revolt in 635. There was one other major offensive against the Avars, that of the Croatians, who liberated much of the Western Balkans from the Avars during the reign of Heraclius. At the same time, the Serbs arrived, and though they did not actually battle the Avars, they did assert their authority over some Slavs who had been under Avar suzerainty. Now, one of the main primary sources we have for the arrival of the Croats and the Serbs into the Western Balkans is actually written by the Byzantine Emperor Constantine VII Porphyrogenitus. Now, he wrote a book called De Administrando Imperio, or in English, On the Governance of the Empire, and he wrote that work for his son, actually. It was meant to be a kind of instruction manual for his son on various issues regarding, domestic policy, foreign policy, to assist his son in governing the Byzantine Empire. Now, the work also has a lot of historical information in it. It details the arrival of the Avars, it details the arrival of the Slavs, and it also deals with the conquest of the Avars by the Croats. So now I will quote a little bit from Constantine's work directly. The Avars made themselves masters of all the country of Dalmatia and settled down in it. Only the townships on the coast held out against them, and continued to be in the hands of the Romans, because they obtained their livelihood from the sea. The Avars, then seeing this land to be most fair, settled down in it. But the Croats at this time were dwelling beyond Bavaria, where the Belo-Croats or White Croats are now. From them split off a family of 5 brothers, Klaukas, Lobelos, Kozensis, Mauchlo, and Chorbatos, and 2 sisters, Tauga and Bauga, who came with their folk to Dalmatia and found the Avars in possession of that land. After they fought one another for some years, the Croats prevailed and killed some of the Avars, and the remainder they compelled to be subject to them. And so, from that time, this land was possessed by the Croats, and there are still in Croatia some who are of Avar descent and are recognized as Avars. Constantine goes on to write, From the Croats who came to Dalmatia, a part split off and possessed themselves of Illyricum and Pannonia. They too had an independent prince, who used to maintain friendly contact, though through envoys only, with the Prince of Croatia in Dalmatia. The reason why the Avars and then subsequently the Croats and Serbs were so successful in kind of dominating these Byzantine territories, these Roman territories, was due to the fact that Rome was so distracted to the east, mainly with the Persians. And this is something that we will see kind of going forward throughout history and stuff we discussed in previous videos. The fact that the Byzantines a lot of times cannot defend their Balkan territory, their Balkan holdings, because they are distracted, again, with either Persian or Arab, later Ottoman advances, attacks from the east. And here John Fine writes, quote, The early 7th century was a period of chaos for the empire. The Balkans were swamped by Slavic settlement, much of it under Avar direction. At the same time, the empire was involved in an all-out war with the Persians. Thus, if the Croatians wanted to move into the Balkans, there was little or nothing the empire could do to stop them. Now, although the Serbs obviously will move into this territory, into the Western Balkans, unlike the Croatians, they don't actually engage the Avars directly. Basically, it's the Croats who are really doing the bulk of the work here, the fighting, that pushes the Avars out of the Western Balkans. And it's really kind of the Serbs who just kind of move in behind the Croats, it appears, and kind of fill out of the vacuum that is left behind by the Avars, but don't actually, again, engage the Avars themselves. Here, John Fine writes, quote, Constantine makes no mention of Serbs fighting the Avars, and there is no evidence that the Serbs did fight them, even though the Avars had previously directly controlled at least part of this territory. So again, not a lot of evidence that the Serbs directly engaged the Avars the way that the Croatians did. But nevertheless, the Serbs will move into part of this Avar-controlled territory, basically to the east of the Croats, with the dividing line basically running somewhere through kind of the region of Bosnia. Here I will continue quoting John Fine. Quote, Constantine describes the Serbs settling in southern Serbia, Zahumlje, Trebinje, Pagania, and Konavli. This situates some of them in the southern part of the Dalmatian coast as well. The Croats were settled in Croatia, Dalmatia, and western Bosnia. The rest of Bosnia seems to have been a territory between Serb and Croatian rule. The mass of Slavs, or Sloveni, who had settled over most of what is now Yugoslavia during the preceding decades, were one people. The Serbs and the Croats, whom Constantine mentions, were a second migration of a different people, who did not seem to have been particularly numerous. John Fine goes on to write, quote, Both traditions, the Croatian and the Byzantine, stress that in the 7th century, after the initial Slavic invasions, there was a second migration of Croatians and Serbs. The Byzantine tradition dates it to the reign of Heraclius, 610 to 641. The Croatian tradition assigns it no date, but simply has it following the Avar occupation. It gives no data that would disagree with a Heraclean dating. Thus, first there was a Slavic migration into what is now Yugoslavia under the Avars, with a strong suggestion of Avar settlement as well. And later, under Heraclius, a second migration composed of Croatians and Serbs. When the Avars were driven out, these new people then settled in particular regions and became the rulers of the population living in those regions. This population presumably consisted of indigenous peoples and the Slavs who subsequently settled there. So what we see here is that both the Serbs and the Croats move into a region that is dominated by Avars, but is populated primarily by Slavs and the indigenous Romans. So the Serbs and the Croats are not these Slavic tribes. They are a separate group of people that come in a second wave and simply push out the Avars as the rulers of these Slavs and take over kind of controlling those Slavic tribes. Now, this begs the question of who were the Serbs and the Croats? Who were these people who came in subsequently after the initial Slavic migrations and pushed out the Avars and took control of the Western Balkans and subjugated the Slavs and the Romans who lived there? Well, I think a lot of people are under the impression that the Serbs and the Croats were Slavic tribes, but more powerful, better organized Slavic tribes who came in and dominated the less well-organized, the less powerful Slavic tribes who lived there. However, that's probably not the case. They probably were not Slavs themselves, but a Eurasian peoples not dissimilar to the Avars or the Bulgars. If we, quote John Fine here, he writes now, using Constantine as a primary source, he writes, quote, Scholars accepting Constantine's account have then turned to the existing data on the Croatians. First, linguists have taken the names of the 5 brothers and 2 sisters which are given and claim that these names are not Slavic. They find that the word Croat, related to the brother Chorobatos, also is not Slavic. Most linguists believe it is similar to an Iranian place name, Choratos, on the lower Don. Scholars also have found references in various scattered sources to a white Croatia, which then lay north of the Carpathians. This state continued to exist in the 10th century in Constantine's time, even after some of its members migrated south. It lay in the general area that Constantine says that the Croats came from. White Croatia is referred to in a variety of sources, independent of one another, such as Russian chronicles and 10th century Arab geographers. One Arab geographer, al-Masudi, says that the white Croat chief drank fermented mare's milk, a characteristic of Turco-Tatar nomads rather than of Slavs. Linguists have also arrived at similar conclusions for the Serbs, with confirmation in other sources of a state of white Serbia. The name Serb is also not thought to be Slavic. Around the time of Christ, there was an Iranian tribe on the Don known to Greek geographers as Serbi or Serboi, and in the 10th century, an Arab geographer noted a Sarban tribe in the Caucasus. These two tribes are clearly not Slavic. Thus, there is considerable evidence to suggest that the Serbs and the Croats who came to the Balkans in the early 7th century were not Slavs, but members of another ethnic group, probably Iranian. Though their names were probably Iranian, it does not rule out the possibility that some or even all of the Croats and the Serbs were then Slavic-speaking, for such groups are named after their leadership. Thus, many Slavs could have participated in the armies and have migrated into the Balkans with them. Furthermore, assimilation of the actual Iranians could already have taken place beyond the Carpathians. After all, names may survive long after linguistic change. As we have seen, the Antes, though Slavicized, still bore an Iranian name. The Croats and Serbs seem to have been relatively few in number, but as warrior horsemen fighting against disunited small tribal groups of Slavs on foot, they were greatly superior militarily. They arrived, expelled the Avars, and then, as tough, tightly knit groups of warriors, were able to dominate the disorganized Slavic tribes. They were able to provide a ruling class and be a source of unity for the different Slavic groups. Soon the newcomers came to provide a general name for all the people, the majority of whom were Slavs under them. Now, if this process of Croatian and Serbian ethnogenesis in the early Middle Ages sounds familiar at all, it is because it is almost identical to that of Bulgaria and the Bulgarian ethnogenesis. Here, in this regard, John Fine writes, quote, "Since the Slavs were the vast majority, as the Serbs and Croats intermarried with them, in time the conquerors came to speak Slavic too, and ironically, the Slavic language they came to speak and which had been spoken by the earlier arriving Slavs, the Sloveni, came to be named after the Iranian newcomers. This is an almost identical process to that exhibited by the Turkic Bulgars who conquered the Slavs in what is now Bulgaria. They came to be Slavicized in time, but provided the name for the Slavic people, language, and state established in Bulgaria. The fact that the Serbs and the Croats were not Slavic but Iranian is not important in the long run, since the Iranians were a small minority in a population of Slavs. They quickly became assimilated by the Slavs, and the resulting society was clearly Slavic, despite the non-Slavic name and the non-Slavic origin of its ruling class." So here we see that by this thesis, there is no difference between Bulgaria, Serbia, and Croatia. This is a mass of Slavs, along with some of the indigenous Romans who came to be dominated by a Iranian, Turkic, Eurasian, whatever they may be, ruling class, a small ruling class who then again came to dominate the larger Slavic population, became Slavicized themselves, and the name of the ruling class, whether it be Serb, Croat, or Bulgar, simply stuck over the ages, although the population is predominantly Slavic. So here we see that the Macedonists, the pure-blooded sons of Alexander the Great, can now start calling the Serbs and the Croats Tatar Mongols, along with the Bulgarians. Now, it must be said that throughout the 20th century, this Iranian theory has led to a bit of controversy. As John Fine writes here in his book, a lot of Croatian nationalists appear to have misused Constantine's work throughout the 20th century to prove a difference between the Croats and the Serbs, the modern-day Croatians and Serbs, not the old tribes from the early Middle Ages, but to prove a difference between the modern Croatians as the Serbs, as nationalistic tensions between the two groups began emerging. So here I'll just quote from John Fine so you get an idea of what we're talking about. He writes, quote, "What must be understood is that in dealing with Constantine Porphyrogenitus, one must accept his accounts for both Serbs and Croats or reject both. It is beyond belief that one of these stories could be correct and the other false, particularly when verification exists for both a white Serbia and a white Croatia beyond the Carpathians. Yet, in this century, the 20th century, As nationalistic squabbles and hatreds developed between Serbs and Croats in pre-war Yugoslavia, various chauvinists, in this case particularly Croatians, have wanted to prove that the Croatians have nothing in common with the Serbs and have taken as accurate only the Croatian material from Constantine. In general, these Croatians, under the influence of the Habsburgs, under whose empire they lived until the First World War and whose universities they attended, have felt that the Slavs were inferior to the Iranians and have tried to assert that Constantine was correct in providing evidence for the Iranian origins of the Croats, but incorrect in regard to the Serbs, who were Slavs. However, one cannot pick and choose what is desirable in Constantine and reject less satisfying statements with no further evidence to back one up. Thus, if one takes him as basically accurate, then it is evident that both the Serbs and the Croats were Iranian people who were close cousins and who conquered a Slavic population that was basically a single people. So here we get this kind of weird position from the Croatians of the 20th century that the Iranians are superior to the Slavs, and therefore they tried to assert that the Croatians are Iranians, but the Serbs were not. The Serbs were a Slavic tribe, thereby kind of demonstrating the superiority, if you will, of the Croatians over the Serbs. Again, that's a kind of a nonsensical position. Either they were both Iranian or neither of them were Iranian. This is a false division being created between the Serbs and the Croats by these quote-unquote, Croatian chauvinists. Now, there are people who reject entirely the Iranian theory of the origins of the Croats and the Serbs, and these are mostly pro-Slavic, or you call it Slavophilic elements, who are skeptical of Constantine's work and kind of push a Slavic origin theory of the Croats and the Serbs, and here John Fine addresses that as well. There is a second school of thought which formerly was the dominant one, but whose popularity has been declining over the last 30 years or so. Espoused by the eminent philologist Vatroslav Jagic around the turn of the century, it can be called the quote-unquote Slavic school. In general, its adherents were willing to view the Serbs and Croats as one people, but were unwilling to see the leadership in establishing the Croatian and Serbian societies in the hands of a non-Slavic peoples. This school visualized one migration of Slav Serbs and Slav Croats in the late 6th and early 7th century and believed that these were the same migrants later when the Avars grew weaker, who overthrew them and eventually established Croatian and Serbian states in what is now Yugoslavia. This school rejected the testimony of Constantine Porphyrogenitus, stressing the fact that the emperor was writing in the 10th century, and that much in his account was clearly legendary. For example, the 2 sisters and 5 brothers. They argue that earlier 7th century material in his account was either legend or bits of fact so mixed up with legend that it is now impossible to extract a true story. They of course stressed all of Constantine's contradictions and errors in fact. They also pointed out that the 7th century was a period from which few Byzantine sources survive and wondered how much of the material from that century was intact when Constantine was writing. At the beginning of this century, the 20th century, most scholars agreed with Jagic, one of the greatest minds in the field, and of course there is a great deal of truth in his objections. There certainly is much to be skeptical about in Constantine's account, for it is not an ideal source for the 7th century. But in the last 30 years or more scholars have come to put faith in the 10th century emperor. Much of this change in attitude is due to the discovery of other independent sources, both Russian and Arabic, which verify the existence of White Croatia and White Serbia north of the Carpathians. This evidence was not available to those late in the last century, 19th century, who rejected Constantine's account. So, given all the kind of pro-Slavic or Slavophile objections to this Iranian theory, keeping all that in mind, at the end of the day, John Fine here seems to side more with the Iranian theory as opposed to the Slavic theory of the origins of the Serbs and the Croats. And this appears to be mainly due to newly discovered corroborating sources, both Russian and Arabic, as he said, which again support this Iranian theory of the Serbs and the Croats. And he concludes by saying, thus, the general view now is to accept in general terms Constantine Porphyrogenitus' 2 migration account. First, a large migration of Slavs driven into the Balkans by the Avars, and then later, probably in the 620s, a second migration of Iranian Croats and Iranian Serbs who moved into the Balkans, drove out the Avars, subjected the Slavs, and in time were assimilated by them. So that, again, is John Fine's ultimate conclusion as far as the origins of the Serbs and the Croats. Now, I'm sure you're wondering what I think, what my opinion is on the origins of the Serbs and the Croats, whether they're Iranians or Slavs. I would say I kind of tend to lean more towards the Iranian theory, although I'm not completely sold on it by any means. But it clearly makes a lot of sense to me. It's easy to see how these more organized, more hierarchical, more powerful Eurasian tribes came in from the steppe and conquered the existing Slavs who lived in the Balkans. It's easy to see how these small ruling tribes became Slavicized due to being outnumbered by the Slavs as time progressed. And we have a clear example of this happening in Bulgaria, like I said. It's a clear kind of example of how this can occur. Now, the reason why we know this occurred in Bulgaria, but are more skeptical or not as clear when it comes to the Serbs and the Croats, is because Bulgarian history is a lot more well documented than Serb and Croatian history. When it comes to kind of the early Middle Ages, Bulgarian history is kind of second to Byzantine as far as the amount of sources we have, the records, and so forth. I mean, this book here, The Early Medieval Balkans, the core of this book, the vast majority of the material in here focuses on the Bulgars and the Bulgarian ethnogenesis, the first Bulgarian Empire, because that is where we have the most records. The records are far less when we start dealing with Croats and Serbs, as we will see in the next couple videos when we deal with the medieval history of the Serbs and the Croats. That history is not as well documented as the Bulgarian history. So it is a bit more mysterious. It is a bit more, murky as far as who the Croats were, who the Serbs were, how this ethnogenesis of the kind of Croatian and Serbian nations took place. But it is very, very logical to see how the Serb and Croatian ethnogenesis could have been very similar to the Bulgarian one in terms of a small Eurasian tribe coming in from the steppe and dominating the Slavs who live in the areas which they come to control. So I do like this theory. I kind of lean towards this Iranian theory as opposed to the purely Slavic origins of the Croats and the Serbs, but I think the debate is still open. I'm certainly, again, not sold on the Iranian theory 100%. There's certainly room for debate there, but again, I do kind of lean in that direction. But let me know what you guys think in the comment section. What do you think about the Croatians and the Serbs? Were they the original Croats and Serbs, that is? Were they Iranians? Were they Slavs? Do you have another theory? Let me know what you guys think. Maybe you can start a civilized debate, please, in the comments section. And we'll, again, in the next couple episodes, move forward to more substantial Croatian and Serbian history throughout the Middle Ages. So until then, thank you very much for watching, and I will see you next time.